and
Hello, Michelle. How are you doing? All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Emma Lagle, and I am the legal fellow with the PACE Energy and Climate Center. The Climate Center has been a leader working at the intersection of energy and the environment for over 30 years. And obviously, this expertise has led us to engage in these important conversations around the scaling of green and low carbon hydrogen to achieve state and national economy-wide decarbonization goals. Aware of time, we're going to jump right into introductions from our three panelists. We brought together a panel with varied perspectives on policy and regulatory needs to lead us into scaling for hydrogen. And so we'll start with Rachel Fakhry from NRDC. Rachel.
Thank you, Emma. Hi, everyone. I'm Rachel Fakhry. I'm a senior policy analyst with the Natural Resources Defense Council. We've been doing a lot of thinking on how hydrogen fits into kind of the deep decarbonization picture and trying to devise or figure out what to support in terms of policies. So I think for today, I don't have any slides. What I thought would be best for me to kind of lay out a narrative for how NRDC is thinking about this. And this is such a new space, and I'll get to this in a bit, but the policy space is turning out to be a really interesting and quite intricate world. So I think today I'll be posing more questions than I think I'll be answering. So I always like to start any introduction to hydrogen with a factoid that I think really underscores just how big this is getting. And that is that by 2025, the countries that will have some sort of a national hydrogen strategy or roadmap will cover more than 80% of GDP. The US will be the only major economy without a document. And this gives you a sense of how big this is getting, but also that the US will likely produce something of the sort in the near term. And of course, in New York in particular, there's been some really interesting momentum towards hydrogen that is creating some really interesting policy regulatory questions. In fact, I do think that hydrogen is kind of putting forth some of the most complex kind of policy-related questions and kind of brain-scratching questions. Because on the one hand, renewable storage, EVs, those are easy. We know we need a ton of those, so we can kind of, go all in terms of policy support and incentives and all those things. Hydrogen is much more tricky. On the one hand, it has this really great potential to help us decarbonize some of the most challenging sectors that may not have better alternatives. So this suggests that we need to be bold, especially in this decade, as we need to build experience and improve the technology and all that, such that it's ready to be used in 2030 onwards. On the other hand, there are some pitfalls that warrant caution. In particular, and we'll get to those kind of related to some of the production pathways that are being put forth as potential solutions, but may have some climate issues, public health issues. Other pitfalls relate to potential applications. It has some great applications, but it has some applications where it could work, but doesn't make a lot of sense in terms of economics, climate impacts, and all these sort of things. So all these kind of potential downsides suggest that we need to be more cautious. So you have this kind of tension in the policy world where on the one hand, you need to be bold and develop the solutions for the climate crisis. On the other hand, we need to be cautious and make sure that we have all the information we need to produce some of the most kind of effective policies in the near term. So, and I think New York is becoming the battleground for a lot of these considerations. As you know, a lot of projects are being proposed, you have opposition, boosters, and I think it really gets at the core of this tension point. I do want to end by saying that we can get this wrong at this point. We don't have time to get it wrong and kind of correct course. We're already really in the red alert zone. This decade is extremely consequential in terms of our action on climate. So we need to be very consciously developing policy frameworks that channel this really great resource from the outset into its highest value places. And we need to be developing the right guiding principles to get it right from the start. So some kind of high level pieces here, and we'll get to those during the conversation, I'm sure. I think the first question needs to be, how does this all fit into the big deep decarbonization picture. And I think Trevor just expressed this well when he said we cannot look at incremental solutions anymore. And I completely agree. We need to be looking at how hydrogen fits into the big picture, as opposed to trying to kind of force it into places where it may not make some great sense. And then based on this kind of initial vision setting, then we can kind of start thinking around, well, in the near term, what can we do? What sort of no regret applications we can target? And then for the longer term, kind of figure out what sort of policies we can put in today to help scale up this resource for things like maritime shipping and aviation, where there's still a lot of questions and R&D needs to happen. And I do want to end by saying that there are some legitimate concerns around hydrogen. I know we have a few, and those should be taken very seriously. But I do think that we should not be pushing this off the table too prematurely on account of some of these concerns, and instead adopt a more kind of comprehensive and constructive approach to trying to devise strategies, policies that address some of these concerns. So with that, back to you, Emma, and really excited for the conversation. Thanks again for having me.
Thank you, Rachel. And I'll introduce our second panelist, Bob Wyman, who is a beneficial electrician advocate and an independent intervener in utility rate cases. Bob?
Yeah, good afternoon. Thank you very much for including me in this fascinating conversation. Probably the most, I am beneficial electrification advocate, primarily focused on the heating problem, heating of space and water in buildings. But probably most relevant to this meeting, I think I'm an individual intervener in the utility rate cases that actually set the electric and gas rates in Westchester County and define many of the operational requirements for the utilities that operate there, Con Ed, NYSEG, et cetera. Without question, I think as we've heard today, hydrogen has a great many really good applications. Particularly from my point of view, the use of hydrogen as a battery, as a means for storing electricity is particularly interesting. As Mike Ducker pointed out, in the future, we won't be seeing curtailment of renewables in the winter when we have a tremendous need for heating our homes and also for charging our electric vehicles. What we're going to have is we're going to have large deficits in renewable supply, and those deficits could be addressed if we had a way of doing long-term storage, essentially storing the excess electricity that we may be producing during the summer and holding it over so that we can generate electricity during the winter. Hydrogen can help provide that kind of long-term storage and really make the vision of renewables feasible. But while hydrogen has many great applications, and I could probably go on for another half hour just listing them, what I want to do here is I want to talk today about one application that should not use hydrogen, something for which hydrogen is absolutely not suited. And it's important to understand that just because hydrogen is great for some applications, or even many applications, that doesn't mean it's great or even good for all applications. Specifically, I'm impressed by all the research that makes it very clear that hydrogen should not be delivered as piped gas for heating of space and water in homes and buildings. Electricity used in heat pumps provides much more efficient heating and cooling. As we heard in an earlier section, they described the challenge we're facing in producing sufficient clean electricity. Well, either blue or green hydrogen production requires a tremendous amount of electricity. If we were to switch the gas utilities from methane to hydrogen, or even in larger quantities of hydrogen mixed in with something like renewable natural gas, we might need to either double or triple the amount of electricity that we'd need, say, by 2050. Double the amount that we'd need instead of, say, switching from natural gas to electricity to be used for heating within heat pumps and also electricity to be used in vehicles. It's hard enough to supply the electricity for electric vehicles and heat pumps that we already know that we're going to need in the future. There is no way that we'll be able to produce enough electricity to also switch all the other, basically switch out the methane that's in our gas networks and replace it with hydrogen. We just can't produce enough electricity to make that possible. But one thing that's important to understand too is that even if we did switch out all the natural gas and replace it with hydrogen, we'd still need electricity for all the applications that that people use natural gas for today. For instance, if you're heating your home, you still need electricity to run your fans and blowers to distribute the heat within your home. If you've got a stove, you probably have an electric pilot system. So you need electricity to turn the stove on, okay? So what we'd have to do if we did switch to hydrogen is, first of all, you have to replace all those appliances, because if you have more than, say, 10 or 15% hydrogen concentration in your gas supply, you have to replace all of your burners and all your appliances and things. You also have to fix all the pipes because they're leak prone. You have to change all the pressure regulators on all the connections to the set. It's a tremendous amount of cost. But most importantly, what you're doing is you're maintaining a system that has two critical points of failure. If either electricity or gas, hydrogen in this case, are interrupted for some reason, you have no ability to heat your home or to cook your food. It doesn't make sense to build a system that has two critical failure points, when in fact we can build a cheaper system that has only one critical failure point, and we can work a great deal at making sure that that failure point is as resilient as possible. It's also important to note that no one, neither at the gas utilities in New York State, nor in the Department of Public Service staff or anyone else, has put forward even a hint of a plan showing that sufficient hydrogen can be produced to displace enough natural gas to allow the utilities to meet the CLCPA goals of a 40% reduction in emissions by 2030 or an 85% reduction by 2050. Given that, it doesn't make sense to invest today in expensive infrastructure whose costs simply cannot be recovered from what will inevitably be a declining user base over the next 30 years. We're going to end up with very expensive stranded assets that will have no one to pay for them. So we're either talking about bankrupting the gas utilities after a couple of years, or we're talking about taxpayers coming in and paying off the costs of assets that were put in place that should have had maybe a 50, 60 or longer year useful life, but in fact we've cut them off after only 29 years because that's what the law says we have to do. And we would have to abandon all of the hydrogen assets if hydrogen cannot make it possible for the gas utilities to accomplish their 85% reduction by 2050. And remember too, that 85% reduction is not an 85% reduction from today's consumption of natural gas. That's an 85% reduction from the 1990 level of gas consumption, which means that it's much greater than 85% reduction. Essentially, the CLCPA says, unless you can figure out how to have absolutely carbon-free gas, you got to shut down the gas network. As Trevor said, we shouldn't be investing in incremental solutions unless they're on the path to the full solution we need. So we shouldn't even consider investing in hydrogen for natural gas, for what are today natural gas systems, until somebody can present us with a plan that says that there is going to be, with great with our ability to rely on it, there is going to be enough electricity, enough renewable natural gas, enough whatever, to ensure that those assets will be able to have a reasonably long life. Now, if I could just point out here too, hydrogen, RNG, or renewable natural gas in general, they may be, they attract a lot of attention from the utilities, because essentially the utilities are looking for what one might politely call a business continuation plan, a strategy for staying in business. So it's a way to allow their assets to maintain value in the future. The problem is that the cost to society of protecting those companies will be tremendous. We've got, 1,000, well, in the country at the moment, we have 2.3 million miles of utility gas pipes. We've got 300,000 miles of transmission pipelines. That's all very expensive stuff. But if we start using high percentages of hydrogen in those pipes, we're going to have to replace most of them anyway. We can't bear that cost. Frankly, we should be primarily focused on the needs of society, not on the needs of the small number of companies. We need to find another way to address their financial issues and provide them with business continuation plans. One which has often been proposed is to get them into the business of geothermal district heating, essentially have them pump heat instead of pumping gas. Society's needs are going to be best served by abandoning gas of any kind for heating our homes and buildings. And if I could just make one last comment here, I just want to point out something and understand that I'm a great supporter of hydrogen for non-piped gas utility applications, okay? But still, it's often been said that hydrogen is clean, okay? Well, it actually would be more accurate to say that hydrogen is cleaner, not that it's clean. Just like CO2, methane, etc., hydrogen, if it's leaked, has a global warming impact. It's on a mass basis, the global warming impact over 100 years for hydrogen is about 5.8 relative to CO2's 1, and obviously that's a lot less than the 26 or so for methane. Its global warming potential over 20 years, which is what we legally have to pay attention to in New York, is about 13. Still a lot less than methane, a lot more than CO2. It is important to note that because hydrogen is a much lighter molecule than CO2, on a volume basis, that means that that actually means that hydrogen's GOP for a given volume of gas is probably about 25 to 50% of that of CO2. So yes, that's much cleaner than CO2. But we have to remember that doesn't mean that it's quote unquote clean. Okay, there's still a problem here. It's much like the issue we were talking about in the chat box about NOx. NOx, or let's say NO2, doesn't itself have global warming potential, but if it's in the atmosphere combining with other things, it will tend to produce things like ozone, which do have very high global warming potential. Hydrogen is the same way. Hydrogen in the atmosphere tends to interfere with the breakdown of methane, which essentially extends the life of methane. And also hydrogen, when burned, which is another problem, tends to produce NOx, which has a high global warming potential. So essentially my message is hydrogen has many wonderful applications. The one thing we must not do is we must not use hydrogen as a replacement for natural gas in our gas utility system. That is absolutely the wrong thing to do. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob. And so our final panelist is Gail Schumann, who is a partner at Sheppard Mullin. And in awareness of time, Gail is part of your, after your introduction, if you have kind of any response to what has kind of just been said by Bob about possibly, not pursuing certain applications, and whether that really kind of works with the idea of needing to transition. So are we able to really transition from the current system while fully avoiding replacement of natural gas with hydrogen? So Gail, please, your introduction.
Yes, it looks like I'm the last presenter of the day, so I'll try not to be too redundant and hopefully not too boring. My name is Gail Suchman. I've been an environmental lawyer for over 30 years in both the public and private sectors. And at Sheppard Mullin, I do a lot of work in the energy space. We do a lot of work on the renewable side, and we're active in advising clients on investments in green hydrogen. And some of our West Coast partners are actually active in the Green Hydrogen Coalition. As you heard from Dr. Nelson, it's really a wonderful organization. I'll make my comments extremely brief and try to focus on what Emma asked me to do. I don't disagree with Bob Wyman regarding use of hydrogen burning in boilers in buildings. But I do want to talk a little bit about the transition and sort of follow up on what Rachel said. There is a growing market for distributed hydrogen production in the U.S. now through the use, or really worldwide, through the use of fuel cells and other types of electrolyzers paired with power generation and industrial processes. And as we know, well, we've heard about all these wonderful projects, IPP, the south of France, the great Mitsubishi technology. The most current production of hydrogen still relies on natural gas for its production. And as the US and the States and the rest of the world moves towards more renewables feeding into the grid, or by pairing hydrogen production with renewable generation or biofuels, as we've discussed, there should be substantial expansion of the use of hydrogen, green hydrogen. But that transition, it is a transition, and it's not a short transition. It's a fairly lengthy transition, whether it's we think it's 10, 20, 30, or 40 years. It's to transition to 100% green energy system and green industrial system is going to be difficult. And that transition itself is of concern to, as Rachel said, to environmental advocates, and particularly to environmental justice advocates. I don't have any answers to that now because you know, if you want to keep the lights on and you want to keep industry going, there's a philosophy that you're going to need natural gas for the transition for a decent amount of time. But that transition in and of itself is of great concern, and should not be forgotten. There are also other many questions, as we also have discussed, regarding infrastructure, storage, above ground storage, underground storage, transport through pipelines. Can we use the existing infrastructure? Lots of people say we can. Lots of people say we can't. Can we transform the existing infrastructure, or do we have to build new infrastructure? That's the issue of whether or not we go to decentralized systems or centralized systems. And I think it was Trevor, or definitely people on the last panel said it's probably going to be, or Mike Dugar, that it's going to be a mixture of both. Siting and permitting is a huge factor. How will we assess the impacts of hydrogen production, particularly looking at climate impacts over a life cycle? And that addresses some of Bob's concerns about leakage. We have tank regulation, underground injection regulation. EPA already has a very robust regulatory regime for underground injection, pipeline safety. And apart from government regulation, we've got private rights, private land rights, and water rights. But the Biden infrastructure bill holds a lot of promise for the expansion of the hydrogen market, you know, through research and development, and through pilots, and through the tax credits. In December, DOE announced what now seems to be a very modest amount, $33 million of R&D money specifically for hydrogen and fuel cell technologies, and now subsumed in a $35 billion R&D fund under the Biden infrastructure plan. It's going to provide monies for hydrogen as well. There are hydrogen demonstration projects that are proposed, and most importantly, the expanded tax credits, which always advances technology. The tax credits are proposed to be extended over 10 years, refundable, to provide investment certainty, which is so very important, and hopefully will include standalone storage, production and storage facilities. Right now, storage facilities don't have a standalone tax credit. They have to be coupled with a wind or solar or geothermal project. And finally, the huge commitment that Biden is making towards electric vehicles, $174 billion. And there is no definition yet to electric vehicles. So is it going to just include batteries, or will it include hydrogen fuel cells cars as well? A couple of things to note for the future. I view hydrogen potential coupled with offshore wind as a real possibility. The question is the offshore wind is going to be along the Northeast coast, close to electricity constrained cities, high density cities with large diverse populations. Is it possible to build a hydrogen production facility in New York? Does it have to be on a platform? There are just, and R&D will really help with that. So this transition is long term, and we have to watch the transition and try to include as many people in the discussion as we can about this transition. But without diminishing the incredible projects that people talked about today and the incredible potential opportunity for hydrogen in the long term.
Great. Thank you so much, Gail, and thank you all three of you for your introductions. I think just from your statements, we begin to see just how complex the considerations are in determining initial policy frameworks for how to move forward, given the various production methods and possible applications. And so I would open up the conversation going back to kind of our initial discussion about possible pathways, and from all three of your different perspectives, starting with Rachel, the policy frameworks that are really being discussed and considered right now to begin moving forward, and what are those initial policies and that are being considered?
Yeah, so the U.S. is lagging compared to Europe in terms of setting up a policy framework for the support of hydrogen. So far, I would say private industry has been leading much of the efforts, and there are some really exciting projects popping up. However, there are some policies that are certainly budding across different states. So, for example, of course, New York, owing to its progressive climate platform, we're seeing a lot of activity here. California as well. So I think both New York and California are currently looking at how to treat hydrogen under their kind of climate policies. In California, there's discussion around, should it be considered under a clean energy standard as a compliant resource? I believe New York is kind of embarking into the same questions. Would it count as a clean energy resource? If so, in which form? Combustion, fuel cells? What is really green? So a lot of kind of these conversations around how to fit it into the landmark kind of climate policy of the state. In California, a really interesting kind of ongoing conversation is around how do you define green? I think Dr. Nelson previously mentioned Senate Bill 18 in California, currently kind of directing state agencies to consider green hydrogen kind of as how it could help the state meet its goals and kind of produce a strategic plan for accelerating deployment. But the main question is, how are we defining green, right? And I completely agree with what I think Trevel said earlier, that we need to move away from colors into more carbon kind of emissions metrics for different pathways, because green can invite a lot of pathways that could have some detrimental impacts, or B, some uncertain impacts. You have to remember, we're trying to move away from a established way of producing hydrogen to new ways in some fashion. And we don't have a good record of some of these production pathways, like, for example, hydrogen production from biomass, right? It could be clean. It could end up being very good for public health, but we just don't know. And there are some important considerations there that we need to go in first, some assessments, better understanding, more record, before we can call it green and start incentivizing it. So that's a really interesting conversation in California, and I have a sense it's going to trickle into other states, but also into federal policy as we start thinking about production tax credits, as Gail just mentioned, which resources would get the credit. So this is the kind of definition conversation is extremely important and worth keeping an eye on. And I think at the federal level, go ahead.
No, go ahead, finish.
Yeah, at the federal level, it's still lagging, although I think folks mentioned President Biden's interest in this. A tax credit is the one that is being floated the most, in particular for electrolyzers, so for the electrolytic version of it, as well as some spending measures. So assisting existing users like refiners and fertilizer producers in their switch from gray hydrogen to green. This is really exciting. This is kind of the most no regret way of scaling up the industry without popping into some of those uncertainties that I think Gail and Bob laid out really, really well.
I wanted to add something, Emma, is that all right?
Yes, of course.
Okay. So I talked about transition and how important it was to include all concerned people in the discussion. and that means also that when we talk about green hydrogen, we do have to deal with the necessary transition that the NISO presented. That was a great presentation to show the reality of how people need electricity, and there needs to be a logical transition. So while I agree with everything that the focus ultimately will be on the definition that's in SB 18 with no hydrogen having any involvement with fossil fuels, it still is a reality that has to be dealt with, and that needs to be part of the discussion as well.
Emma, could I make a comment here?
Yes.
Yeah. It is important that we look, at transitions and transitional technologies, but it's important to remember that just because something is a transition doesn't mean you don't have to pay for it. Anything we do which is transitional must be paid for. Its costs have to be recovered by somebody. And this is the problem we run up against when we're dealing with the rate cases here in New York State, because the gas utilities, for instance, to make the investments in new pipelines or interconnects to sources of renewable natural gas or electrolyzers or whatever, many of the assets, particularly the pipes, to make them affordable, they want to recover their costs over an 85-year period. The difficulty here with that, and in the past, that's what they've done for natural gas pipes. So it's logical that they would want to continue that. But the problem is that if we're talking about a transitional technology, we have to think, well, when will we recover those costs? Will we still be doing whatever it is we're doing 85 years from now? The reality is that if we have to have a dramatic reduction of emissions from the gas network by 2050, and we've got 85-year lifetime equipment, we should have stopped installing that transitional equipment back in 1965, okay? That's when the last sort of new transitional natural gas pipe should have been put in. Or if we're talking about hydrogen here is a transition, that's when the last hydrogen pipe should have been installed. What we need to do now the alternative is we could say, okay, we'll put a whole lot of money into improving the infrastructure so that we can move hydrogen without leaks and the rest. And remember, if you will, Con Ed, who serves Westchester County right now, plans to spend $1 billion a year, every year for the next 3 years in maintenance and update on its existing gas network. Okay, that's what it costs today. It'll be higher if they do hydrogen for the gas utilities, because we're switching to heat pumps and we're doing a lot of other such things. So we're going to be carrying that 85-year-long cost and having fewer and fewer people pay it as every year passes, and we have more people switch to zero-emission heat pump systems. What's going to happen is that the cost of being on the gas system is going to go up tremendously. Okay, you can't have a smaller number of people using less of a product cover the same cost for 85 years without seeing their costs go up dramatically. We could very soon get to the point where gas was free. This is one of the things that frustrates me about all the work that's been done on the efficiency of gas generation, because yeah, we might be able to produce hydrogen much more cheaply and much more efficiently than we do today. We might be able to do the same with RNG, but as long as the user base is declining, we might get to the point where gas, okay, was free, but the cost of the infrastructure itself were causing the cost of being a gas customer to go out of sight. We should be focusing on using hydrogen for the things that it is most valuable for. Okay, things like storage for electricity, things like powering vehicles that can't otherwise, at least at the moment, be powered by electricity, chemical processes, and all sorts of other things, and displacing fossil fuel from the chemical and pharmaceutical industry, as at least where they need hydrogen. Replacing the use of fossil fuel as a hydrogen source for ammonia production. These are all really important things to do and valuable things to do. We don't need hydrogen as a transition strategy for the gas network, that's a really dumb use of hydrogen, and one which will end up producing vast quantities of stranded assets that somebody is going to have to pay for, and it's probably going to end up being taxpayers. But
thank you, Bob. We have to wrap up in 2 minutes for Michel to do a full wrap up of the event. And so I would just end our discussion. Obviously, there's so many points being made on multiple sides of this conversation that we could keep diving into in much more detail. And so I would ask the three of you if there was a kind of single initial policy or regulatory item that from your perspectives is the kind of most important to pursue right now, what might that be?
I'm happy to start. I would say due diligence is absolutely necessary. We've used this for a long time in industry, fertilizer refineries, sure, but we're trying to. And we need to, as I mentioned earlier, besides kind of trying to answer those questions, like Bob was mentioning the greenhouse gas impact or potential for leakage or NOx emissions, all these different things, we also need to understand where it fits, as I mentioned. And I think Bob again said that right now that it has these really great applications that we need to kind of focus on. So I think first and foremost, robust knowledge base is necessary as PUC start revising and kind of reviewing applications for new, hydrogen-based plants, or the future of heat that National Grid is trying to pursue in New York around trying to transition its gas system to hydrogen. There needs to be this knowledge base. And then afterwards, I think, in terms of what we can do more concretely, look for no regret applications. Look for applications that will occur, and that are robust and consistent no matter what future we're envisioning for hydrogen. That is what Europe is starting to look into, and it's really interesting. Is existing users that use hydrogen, those are not going away for a long time. Let's start by transitioning those into green hydrogen. This will scale up the industry significantly without trying to solve for things where the knowledge is still quite thin. So I would start with due diligence, no regret applications.
Yeah, and I totally agree. I think we need to look at hydrogen as a valuable, rare, precious resource, okay, relative to the total needs of all combustibles, okay?
Bob, can you just...
And we need to prioritize the use of hydrogen and make sure that it's only used in the best applications.
I wanted to let you know that I will leave the event on for another half an hour, so you may continue this conversation. What I wanted to do is thank you so much, all of you, to come and speak to this event, and all of you for attending this event. This is just the first. I wanted to come back perhaps in the fall with another of these kind of sessions, perhaps focusing on special uses of hydrogen. And one of them that is close to my heart is going to be how to create alternative fuels from recycling, for instance, hydrogen, or let's say recycling jet fuel that there are uses today you can't really replace. There are uses for hydrogen you can make happen. For instance, if you combine carbon dioxide and hydrogen, I have a dear friend on this event now attending, you can create anything you want, which you can't really replace today. Really, you cannot put a large lithium-ion batteries on the airplane. We're doing that already. You can perhaps do other things, but it's going to be a difficult transition, as Gail said, in the transition. So we'll do another event like this, hopefully in the fall, hopefully in person. Although I find this a lot more efficient in all ways. If you want to be efficient and carbon, low carbon, this is an amazing event. Thank you very much, all of you, and looking forward. Keep on going, Bob. I'm sorry to interrupt, and I'll be out of the way, as we call. Thank you.
Thank you, Michel.
Thank you, Michel. Bob, did you want to kind of finish your thoughts, and then Gail will finish with you?
So no, I think I said it. I totally agree with Rachel. I think we need to view hydrogen as a precious, rare resource, and we need to manage it as what it is, as a precious, rare resource, and make sure that it isn't squandered on silly applications. And frankly, a replacement for natural gas in as piped gas, that isn't the way one uses a resource which has the potential that this one does. So the policy I would suggest is a policy that does what she suggested, that prioritizes, discovers the applications, prioritizes them, and attempts to manage the process by which we use hydrogen in our energy system.
And I agree with what Rachel and Bob said. I think that there is a lot of great uses that are maybe available, that are going to become available in the short term as renewable energy source, more renewable energy sources become available. And I do think that pairing with the industry processes or natural gas CTGs, all of that can be done in the more short term while we're studying the issues of infrastructure for centralized systems, you know, with the storage tanks and pipelines. So I think I know there's a lot of discussion that we shouldn't do this incrementally, but I think that there's a way to take advantage of hydrogen use also in automobiles and transportation, as Michelle said earlier, and then look at some of the longer term uses that will cost a lot more money and require a lot more infrastructure.
Could I make one other comment? Yeah, and that is, it is this. You know, there's sometimes I've got a lot of history in the computer business where we introduce new technologies and products. And one of the things you always want to do is avoid problems you don't need to be constantly on the edges. And I would suggest it's just not useful to encourage opposition from the environmental community. There are so many applications for hydrogen that literally nobody's going to object to. But the moment people start talking about pipelines, you know, extending the life of gas pipelines, you know, encouraging expansion of gas supply in cities, et cetera, okay, you immediately attract the attention of like literally every environmentalist for hundreds of miles around wherever that's being discussed. And it's just not worth it, okay? There are so many things that you can do in which you essentially are talking only about like, what can we do? How do we finance this? How do we move forward in a positive way, as opposed to having to spend all your time defending your technology and your approach and saying, yes, yes, but I've got these other things which are also good. It just isn't worth it from an industry point of view to have to deal with fighting the environmentalists. Why don't you just stay away from that application? And then frankly, the environmentalists will all be on your side and they'll be powering you forward instead of trying to hold you back. And anybody who's in New York knows that the environmentalists in New York are making life very difficult for the hydrogen people. It is totally unnecessary, okay? Absolutely unnecessary.
I don't know. I wasn't advocating anything that was, using natural gas pipelines. So I was advocating what can be done in a clean way as we move towards more renewable sources on the grid, or pairing hydrogen production with renewable resources. So I agree with you. I agree with you. That's why I said something about being careful about transition and bringing as many people into the conversation as possible.
And I think, Gail, that this type of conversation is just that type of conversation that needs to be had to really be moving us forward. And so I want to thank all three of you for being here today and engaging in this conversation. I believe Michel is still on. And so thank you to him and Sustainable Westchester for putting this entire event together. And hopefully we see a number of you back for the next event that we schedule for later in the year. So thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So I'm
job.
I'm open to anyone to stay on. Anyone wants to unmute themselves and ask direct questions, that will be fine.
Hey, I have a question. So are there technologies in place to control the NOx emissions of hydrogen if we were to use it in a combustion application?
Who wants to take it?
I'm happy to jump in there. So this is Mike Ducker with Mitsubishi. And yes, I mean, going back to the presentation I showed, we've already achieved upwards of 100% hydrogen utilization in our gas turbines dating back to the 1970s. Our entire focus today is achieving the same ultra low levels of NOx of 2 ppm in today's combustion gas turbines, which is required, for natural gas. I don't know if you saw in the chat post, but I did put some comments there about NOx, where today's gas turbines are at on NOx and how that relates to an industry as a whole. But the main story here, the message is absolutely NOx is a very important pollutant that we have to address. But the good news is, as we continue to look to retire older infrastructure, coal-fired units, oil-fired units, even gas-fired units that have been around for some time, convert them to today's latest state-of-the-art technologies, we'll actually have a significant net reduction in NOx emissions for these types of facilities.
Anyone else?
I have another question on combustion turbines and using hydrogen in them. Because the hydrogen heat rate is lower than natural gas heat rate, how does that work? Like, do you need to run the turbine longer or compress the gas more? How does that kind of work?
Yeah, so hydrogen basically is about takes about three times more volume than natural gas, and so really at the core, our approach on designing the combustion systems of gas turbines is actually controlling the combustion temperature. And so in doing so and achieving the same temperatures as today's gas turbines, there actually will not be any type of impact necessarily on efficiencies nor output for the same model engine. We are putting through then more volume of gas, but actually much less mass of gas. So hydrogen on a mass basis has a lot more energy than natural gas. So what this ultimately ends up requiring is rather simple design changes in the gas turbine. So we need larger diameter piping, larger valving, larger gas turbine enclosures because we've got bigger volumes of gas coming through. But again, as far as the design or what we've done from an efficiency and power standpoint, it's targeting at those same temperatures that our gas turbine blades and vanes see on natural gas. And this is just a fundamental design philosophy that Japan and our parent company has taken to try to minimize the amount of retrofits and other types of rework that would be necessary in today's gas turbines.
Thank you.
Does the fact that the gas just burns at like half the temperature make any difference in the turbines? You're saying it doesn't?
No, and so actually there's some unique items with hydrogen, particularly as we start talking about startup shutdown and transient stages of operating hydrogen. The flame is, typically we're actually trying to avoid flame out on natural gas, but with hydrogen it's a bit more stable, particularly these lower operating ranges. And so we're actually looking, exploring every steam generator in the back end. That's where we're boiling water and using the waste heat coming off the back end of the gas turbine to produce steam for a steam turbine. But no, there's no hydrogen going in any boilers or anything like that.
I mean, that's one of the things when we were just briefly just chatting before, there's a lot of physics around some of this stuff. And I obviously don't understand a lot of the application issues, but it has about a third the BTUs of a propane or a natural gas. It has half the burning temperature. I think it was at 900 and some odd degrees versus 1900. And so those are all things, those are all part of the physics. It you know, it likes to dissolve certain steel pipes and stuff like that, just pure hydrogen.
Yeah, and I think this is where, as I think as Rachel was mentioning it, you know, it's really important that we just have these open dialogues and have meetings like this to talk about it. And so, look, even the hydrogen embrittlement, we hear about it all the time. Again, understand that we've got 1,700 miles of 100% hydrogen pipelines that have been being operated in the United States for decades right now. They go through major cities like Los Angeles, Salt Lake City, Houston, Texas. Most people don't realize that the infrastructure exists today, and for good reason, because luckily we haven't had big issues with leakage and, you know, explosions and other items. This isn't to minimize the concerns of hydrogen. Absolutely, it's something we have to be careful of, and we have to be, you know, cautious. But the good news is, you know, we've got best practices and codes and standards in the United States with decades of experience in the petrochemicals industry that we can rely on as we look at applying those same philosophies in the power industry and elsewhere. Bert,
you wanted to ask a question.
I actually had a comment. I've enjoyed this panel and these panels very much. So I'm with facilities at Cornell University, the Ithaca campus, large campus. We have two 15 megawatt electric combustion gas turbines. But we're committed to a carbon neutral campus by 2035. And one thing I think that's important, and for the systems that are talked about here, is that when electricity is used in electrolysis to make the hydrogen, that it be actually carbon free. And that's not easy to know. So we've been spending a lot of time trying to figure out what the marginal emission rate of the grid is, and when if you add load to the grid, it's natural gas that a plant somewhere picks up the load, or when there might be curtailed solar or wind or hydro that picks up the load. And of course, you want the latter so that it's carbon-free electricity running the electrolysis unit. It's not easy to get. We've modeled the system. We've used contractors to model the system. New York ISO does not provide that data yet. They may in the future when there's a carbon price put on wholesale bulk electricity. Now the system we're using is a commercial proprietary system used called WattTime, WattTime. They're out of California. California uses them for battery dispatch. So that's the best we have right now. It's basically an artificial intelligence, carbon-free electricity off the grid, and not easy to know when you're doing that. With real physics, you can get renewable energy credits to offset the carbon, but that's a little different. That's all. That's just my comment. Thank you.
Michelle, can I make a comment on
that?
Rachel?
Yeah, just quickly wanted to say, Bert, this is exactly the sort of questions we're asking ourselves as we define, what is green hydrogen? How can you ensure that you're not creating issues elsewhere? So it was really interesting to hear you kind of how you're thinking about it, and just wanted to note how important that is in the policy space currently.
Bill, you want to say something?
Yes, yeah, Bert, you brought up a really good point. And I just wanted to mention that this is becoming a very important topic also for tracking the carbon usage of buildings. So Local Law 97 in New York City is looking at how to track carbon usage in buildings. And one of the things that's coming out of the working groups there is a request to the ISO to actually develop this information. And it is tricky. You have to look at imports, you have to look at how things move around, et cetera. But both NYSERDA and New York City are now approaching the ISO and talking about pathways to generate this information in real time. So I can't guarantee it's going to happen next year, but it's certainly something the state's working on.
Thank you. Any other question? Comment?
Yes, I have a question, I guess, towards Bill Bob Wyman. His concern about the use of hydrogen as a heating source for buildings. Is that also, are you also concerned about that as a source of fuel for transportation, for cars? The whole idea of having a hydrogen fuel car, which has been popularized, is that something that also concerns you, Bob?
Well, I think for like just normal sort of light duty vehicles, I think hydrogen, many of the same issues that I have with hydrogen for heating apply to the use of hydrogen for just sort of normal light duty vehicles. On the other hand, there's long haul trucking, there's specialty vehicles, et cetera, in which I think one can make a case for the use of hydrogen. The difficulty is that if you try to produce a hydrogen distribution network, which is large enough and expansive enough to be able to address the needs of the average light duty vehicle, you're essentially going to have to replace most of the existing natural gas network anyway, because either the pipes don't work or they were designed for lower pressure. I mean, if you're pumping hydrogen, you have to use higher pressure or larger pipes throughout your transmission and distribution system. So the cost would be tremendous. The other problem, of course, is from an efficiency point of view. The efficiency of an electric vehicle is dramatically higher than what you can get resources. It wouldn't be wise, but nonetheless, there are, I think, applications for hydrogen. I think in specialized cases, just not in the average sort of light duty vehicle. The thing that's parked in your garage right now at home, that should not be burning hydrogen, even in fuel cells. That should be an electric vehicle. But a lot of other vehicles might, in fact, be well suited to hydrogen.
And Bob, maybe if I could just add on to your point, I think we certainly agree on that sense too. And I think the simple analogy is looking at like the power sector, where we see batteries serving your short duration, intra-daily needs, hydrogen being your longer duration, more heavy duty needs. And from a transportation side, same thing goes for batteries, light duty vehicles. It's going to make a lot more sense. Whereas long haul trucking, heavy haul equipment, et cetera, hydrogen is going to make a lot more sense. And I forget who said it before, but for trucking, you can haul freight or haul batteries. You can't do both. And the last thing I'll point out, just on the transportation side, we've been working with a lot of folks in the transportation sector, which has been an incredibly exciting part of my role right now, because I'm used to the power side. What they see is, a power plant here, like the Intermountain Power Project, we need upwards of 100 metric tons of hydrogen a day type of demand. And that's just that partial use of hydrogen integration. Once we get 100%, it's a lot more. Conversely, long haul trucking, they're looking at, anywhere from 2, 5, maybe upwards of 10 tons a day type of demand at a fueling station. And so if we look at co-locating this infrastructure and that cross-sector, type of synergies, they then can reap the benefits of the economies of scale of some of these power facilities throughout the U.S. And everything else around that infrastructure, while still achieving their targets around heavy haul trucking. And so again, I think this is a interesting part of hydrogen is it's bringing multiple sectors together who historically haven't really talked, or at least my experience haven't talked to the degree we've been talking here over the course of the past year and a half.
Also, hydrogen, talking about transportation applications, we should remember hydrogen is a great fuel for the kind of transportation systems that NASA, SpaceX, and others produce, and that is rockets. If you want to put something in orbit as a transportation problem, hydrogen is a great fuel for doing that, combined with a little bit of oxygen. But that's a specialized case,
Yeah, and Michelle, I'd like to just comment for a second on the efficiency piece that Bob mentioned. We talked about the stranded assets and all these things, but I think the efficiency piece is absolutely crucial. I think this is one of the main reasons why it would be wise not to pursue hydrogen for, say, buildings or light duty vehicles, is that it is so much less efficient than other kind of direct electrification alternatives. In fact, there's a study that showed that to heat the same building with hydrogen boiler versus a kind of direct electricity, you would require 5 to 6 times more renewable energy. That is huge. And if you look at kind of net zero analyses by Princeton, others that show just how much renewables we need to build by 2050 to meet demands across our economy, it's a whole lot. And we should certainly not be pushing for solutions that are going to multiply this amount of renewables by 2, 3, 4, or 5. And I think this is kind of the guiding principle for a lot of how we're thinking around what are some interesting applications and what are some applications where it just doesn't make any economic sense to pursue.
And it's in favor of the high value in some applications, like
Right.
the fuels, where you can't really replace or transition very easily.
Absolutely. Yep.
Any other question? Unless there's any more questions, we're going to start wrapping up here. And thank you again for participating and actively. And I feel we're going to have to do a second one this year, in the fall, to kind of make a point of where we are and somehow. And just to let you know, we are recording, we have been recording this, and we'll make this event available to participants who wish to have it. Looking forward to more discussions in the fall. All right. Any other questions, or we can wrap it up?
Michelle, as you said before, I just wanted to thank everybody. It was great.
Thank you for disclosure. Warren is on my board. So,
Nice job. Thanks.
Have a good one. Take care, guys. Goodbye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Bye-bye.